And that basically means that these things are kind of locked in place, right? Because if somebody had been doing Star Wars imitations for the last 7, 8 years, those would have evolved into something new at some point, or those would have been imitated, and then maybe there would be an entire genre of Star Wars-like stories, which doesn't exist at this point.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are back. The Eye of the Storm. How you guys doing? I'm here with my boys Daniel and Hervey.
Hi.
Yeah, let's just get straight into it. Guys, do we need more movie ripoffs?
So when we were talking about this and this topic came up, it occurred to us that we always talk about franchises and reboots and sequels and how nothing is original anymore. And it occurred to us that a side effect of that is that nobody is ripping each other off anymore. So it used to be when something got popular, for years there would be a whole bunch of imitators. Most of them would be terrible. Some of them would be decent, and a few would actually be good. And that doesn't seem to be happening at all anymore. If something comes out and is popular, you're not getting a lot of imitators. And that also means that if something is being mishandled, then no competitor fills in to offer an alternative. The only exception that I can think of is the Orville, where if you don't like current Star Trek, the Orville will give you classic Star Trek. And it's not like it's completely unaffiliated. It's basically a ripoff. It's basically fan fiction that somebody made, right? So, but that's the only example that I can think of. And I would argue that that is actually making pop culture and fiction in general worse off, because it means you don't get this iteration where you slowly evolve and refine things. Instead, everybody has kind of their locked franchises where we have clear ideas of what they're supposed to be, and they have their set fandoms, and everybody is kind of off in their own silo, not talking to each other. What do you guys think about that?
No, I agree. And like you said, for like kind of like movie-going audiences, they'll have like their specific favorite like genres, or like favorite sort of subsections of genres and stuff like that they'd want to probably see more of, but don't get enough of it because, like you said, there isn't that imitation and stuff like that. And no, I agree. It's especially when you wait for so long for something to come out and it maybe doesn't hit the heights that you expect, and you probably know that you're going to be waiting a significant amount of time before anyone comes along and tries to sort of maybe do it better in future. So just kind of, you wait for it, you have the high anticipation, maybe leaves a sour taste in your mouth, and then you're then sort of kind of left in the wilderness for a little bit longer.
Personally, for me, I feel 50-50. I don't mind ripoffs as long as I haven't seen it. You know what I'm saying? Because, and which is good. I feel like it's good for a lot of audiences like me, for example, who hasn't watched a lot of the films back in the day, right? So like films in the 80s, 70s, where a lot of people consider the films in those times, especially the 90s, roughly around those times, to be the films where gems were being released. Do you know what I'm saying? So for me personally, I don't mind it in that aspect, because it brings me, it opens my eyes to, films that I've been missing out on. So like, for example, if they produce, there's a reboot of a film back in the day that was amazing, and then they reboot that film and that's amazing again, that will make me want to go and watch the old film again. You know what I'm saying? So I don't mind. But if it's films that I've already seen, I don't need it. You know what I'm saying? Which, of course, the industry doesn't revolve around Jonathan, so they're not going to be checking in to see what films Jonathan has seen. But still, like films films I've already seen and they're rebooting it, I just find it boring. So it's it's a sticky one. And I do know sometimes the industry as well, like when something works, they'll overdo it, like until there's a point where it gets oversaturated. So I remember there was a period, I don't know what period it was, but I remember there was a period where there was just reboots after reboots after reboots. And I think it was because based on one success of one film that was successful from reboot. I forgot what film it was, but yeah, they just like overdo it sometimes. I think there needs to be a balance. Like it's cool, like what I think I think what they need to do is reboot films that failed back in the day and obviously reboot it, but add their own spice to it, rather than reboot movies which were already successful. There's no point of touching it. Just leave that. Maybe reboot films that had a good idea, it just wasn't executed well, whatever year that it was released.
I think there's a difference between a remake and what. So when I say rip-off, I mean something current. So somebody, so a Star Wars movie comes out and maybe it's popular, and then 5 other movies get made that are a bit like Star Wars, right? To cash in on the fad. And the last time I remember this happening is, I'm not sure if Zombies or if Dystopian YA was more recent. I think Dystopian YA is the slightly more recent one, where Hunger Games became really popular, and then they put out all these similar stories that kind of went in the same direction and had a lot of the same ideas and tropes, but were adaptations of. So maybe that is kind of an intermediate stage where those weren't original rip-offs of Hunger Games, but instead they said, okay, what else can we adapt that's a bit similar? And after that, even that seems to have stopped in recent years.
Oh, well, then if that's the case, thank you for clarifying. Sorry, I was just lost. If that's the case, then I'm all for it. The reason why I say I'm all for it is because it depends on the genre. Like, everyone knows I'm a big dystopian fan. So when Hunger Games top 3 film, sci-fi films, dystopian films, whatever genre you want to put it in, of all time for me is between that and Dune 2 and another one which I don't remember. Well, it's not that I don't remember, I just don't know what is in that, list of 3. But between Hunger Games, Dune 2 and another film, I don't know which one's number 1 spot. But yeah, when Hunger Games came out, I was on the hunt looking for more movies like it. So then next they dropped Maze Runner. It was alright. It was good. Obviously not just as good as Hunger Games, but I was still satisfied. So I had a period where I was literally just feasting on that type of film. So when it's a film that kind of like, has a massive impact in your life, you're always going to go out looking for similar movies. For me. So I would kind of be disappointed if they kind of stopped rip-offs, reboots. But I do agree. I do still think with this one, with reboots, now I know like what we're talking about, apologies. I do think there needs to be a balance though. Like, don't overdo it, and make sure if you do have an idea, make sure it's not ripped off to the point where it's a clone, but you just added, let's say for example, there's twins, one has afro hair and another one has freaking blonde extensions, you know what I'm saying? Like, they'll freaking create the same thing. Of course, the idea is cool, like, you've incorporated some ideas which is similar, but add your own sauce, add your own spice. But yeah, I do think there needs to be a balance. Don't overdo it, but at the same time, I'd be lying if I said after watching certain films I wasn't out looking for similar movies or similar TV shows. I don't think rip-offs. Yeah, I think we do kind of need more rip-offs actually.
Yeah, obviously we don't want to overdo it, right? We don't want everything to be the rip-off of the last thing that was popular, right? Mm-hmm. But actually, I'm kind of looking at this from a consumer rights perspective, where not having rip-offs at all basically gives everybody a monopoly on that one particular kind of story, right? Like, if you like the idea of Star Wars, or you used to like Star Wars, and you don't like how it's currently being handled and what stories are currently being told in that universe, there's nothing else like it. You can't go anywhere else. There isn't the Orville equivalent. Or like, if you like zombies but you don't like Walking Dead, there's 15 other shows like it that deal with a similar style and tone, but isn't quite like The Walking Dead. So maybe one of them does what you don't like about The Walking Dead correctly, and that weakens the power of these companies, right? Because now they're not holding an entire type of story hostage. So I'm basically making the consumer rights argument for more rip-offs.
I mean, that's fair. I feel like probably the biggest thing is probably the risk-taking aspect of it from the studios, in terms of, they know that Star Wars, something like Star Wars, will have like a massive fan base, or a Hunger Games and stuff like that, and it's are they willing to risk putting out a movie in a similar sort of space and try to wrestle away some of the fans, or do they go into their own IP bag and dig up an IP that people do love and put out something similar to that? And it just seems like they're kind of choosing the safe option at the moment. I feel like they could probably learn a lot from like the music industry, because like sampling is like a massive thing in the music industry, where you might have a song from like the 60s or the 50s. It's then been sort of remixed in the 90s for maybe a different audience. And then that 90s song has then been given a different spin for maybe the 2010s or 2020s or whatever. And each step of the way that they're adding their own kind of like twist to the original sample. They're adding their own flavor to it and repurposing it for a different audience, so that you've got this original song that people will sort of recognize, and people will be able to recognize it in multiple different songs, essentially, but it's still kind of the same core idea. And that's what probably the movie industry needs a little bit more of, is that, you've got a really good idea. How can we then branch it off to have multiple different things that maybe attract multiple different kind of people towards it, and just kind of give a little bit more variation, a little bit more variety in some of these stories, essentially.
So you guys are leaning more towards having their own IP rather than ripping off from other.
No, I'm leaning more towards ripping off. I'm just kind of explaining why there's a hesitance. They're hesitant to do it.
Which is funny, because the ripoff used to be the low risk play.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You just basically imitate the thing that's already worked, and you change some details slightly, or have a slightly different take on the same thing, and that is supposed to be the low risk play. But now it's seen as more reliable to have your own set of IPs that are just their own thing and don't really respond to what else somebody else is doing. I think the music industry comparison is apt, and another comparison I would make is video games, because there, if something is successful, if somebody has a new idea and builds a game around it, and that is successful, within the year there will be a dozen imitators that are almost entirely the same, and then but over time that will create a new genre, right? Where just you start off with one game, and then you have the imitators, and those imitators figure out what works and what doesn't, and they have maybe different approaches to the same idea. And within a few years, you will have a new genre that didn't exist before. And the same thing has happened in movies, right? Where Halloween, I don't think Halloween is the first slasher movie, but it kind of popularized the idea, right, back in the day. And then a whole bunch of imitators came out, including Friday the 13th, which was explicitly a cash grab, right? It was explicitly supposed to cash in on the trend of teen slasher movies at the time, and for the lowest price possible and for the quickest turnaround possible. And now it's one of the big iconic series in the genre, and the entire genre was shaped by these imitators. So have we lost something by the movie industry moving away from that and doing only established IPs or only original stories?
We don't think that we're living in a so you think so do you think that the era, so it's like it's not a counter question, but it's a question on top of what you just asked. So do you believe that we've kind of moved away from doing ripoffs, basically?
Maybe this is just my own personal bubble, but I just don't see them.
Really?
Right? Like where are it's been a decade since, like, Star Wars is the big elephant in the room, because it's one of the biggest franchises ever, and a lot of people are not happy with how it's being handled and how it's evolved over the past decade. Where are the imitators? Like, if you want something Star Warsy, where can you go?
Rebel Moon, and what's that other film with
Rebel Moon is one, and that's one movie. Okay.
What's
and
the creator?
Sorry?
That's right. That the Star Wars pitch initially did not reach.
Yeah, I mean that was supposed to be a Star Wars movie in the first place. Yeah. So obviously the number of ripoffs is not zero, but it seems to me it's vastly less than it used to be even 10 years ago.
True, but there has been, like, for example, the creator film. That's another Star Wars ripoff. Wouldn't you say?
I wouldn't say that. I would say it's drawing from a whole bunch of different things, including things like Mass Effect and Blade Runner and even Alien, and it draws from a whole bunch of different places. I wouldn't call it Star Wars adjacent at all. It's got the general sci-fi aesthetic, which I actually quite like, but I wouldn't. So for me, Star Wars is things like big space opera, space battles, armies, larger than life heroes, like this kind of adventure story. Lots of different aliens, technologies, places, and I don't think in the past decade there's been anything like it. And in the past, like Battlestar Galactica started off as a Star Wars ripoff, and then evolved into something else. And this is not all about Star Wars. It just seems to be the general trend, in my observation, that has just gone away. And I think as the audience, we're worse off for it, even though that seems counterintuitive, because we always want originality and we're tied with franchises. But I think there's a third pillar there, which is the slightly different imitator.
But the Hunger Games, right? When did the? Because I remember there was a whole bunch of ripoffs. So okay, so how far are we talking right
Hunger
now?
Games was over a decade ago, right? I'm
Yeah,
talking about, let's say, the last 5 years,
the last 5 years.
plus or minus. So the only one that comes to mind for me is The Orville, right? Because that is explicitly Seth MacFarlane saying, I want to see Star Trek, I'm not getting any, so I'll make my own. And I trick the studio into telling them it's a parody, but actually it's not. It's just my Star Trek fan fiction, and stuff like that used to be more common, I think.
Maybe we're just in a period where we just need a break. Not we per se, as in the audience, but the industry. Because remember when The Purge came out, and then there was a whole bunch of ripoffs after that. The Delco Experiment, freaking Hunt, a whole bunch of films just like it, obviously. And then Hunger Games came out, then a whole bunch of ripoffs came out after that. And I remember the time where there was a bunch of found footage movies, Paranormal Activity, As Above, So Below, etc., etc. Right? And then there's a period, and obviously, people that end up dying down. So maybe we're just in a period where obviously, the ripoffs. I don't know when the ripoff periods started dying down, but maybe, like I say, we just need a break from it. Same way, because I believe found footage will come back. I don't know when, but it will come back. So there will be a period as well that I believe that ripoffs will come back, but we just entered that, that phase where okay, people are getting tired of ripoff movies, and now we're in a season of.
I'm not so sure about that because all the examples you've given seem to be early 2010s or earlier. Like those, those don't register for me as moderately recent. And the only counterexample I can think of is actually the superhero genre, because that has a couple of high-profile, not exactly ripoffs, but imitators, right? You've got The Boys, you've got Invincible. So these are using the tropes that were codified by DC and Marvel very explicitly, and often referencing specific characters and things like that, or storylines or tropes. But they're doing it with original characters and with their own spin on it. Usually a more gritty, a more parody-oriented one. But after that, it's already pretty slim, I think.
Yeah, but think about found footage. When did the Blair Witch Project come out?
98, 96.
Okay. And then when did the next big found footage hit come out? Paranormal Activity. When did that come out?
Paranormal Activity, I'd have to look it up, but maybe 10 years after that.
Yeah, so is 10 years really a big gap? And plus, remember, there's lockdown to take into consideration. So COVID disrupted a lot of film output. So
I think if it's real, it happened in the second half of the 2010s, 2016, 17, 18, and that seems to be when the big companies started gobbling up all these IPs and started producing their content pipeline. And that might have something to do with the success of the MCU, where everybody was trying to start their own shared universe, and you do that by taking a long-running IP in a different medium and beginning to adapt that, right? So I don't know. Am I the only one who sees it that way, or like is this just in my particular corner, or is this something that's really happening?
No, I would like what I would say on it is, it seems like what's behind all these ripoffs is having something that's uber successful. And again, I was actually going to touch on this, the superhero genre as being one where you've had loads of different imitators and stuff like that, and maybe it just needs something else to blow up. For example, like in the whatever, it was the Hunger Games that came out, blew up. Everyone wanted to make their own spin on it, and of course the superhero movies have dominated for the past however long. And maybe it's just a case that something new needs to come along where everyone absolutely loves it, and then you start to get the imitations from it again, possibly.
But there were no Game of Thrones ripoffs, right? That was the biggest thing for years, and I don't remember. So it did have an influence on historical dramas.
The Wheel of Time.
Sorry?
The Wheel of Time.
Wheel of Time is, first of all, that's an adaptation of an old book series.
But
the fact that it got adapted is probably due to Game of Thrones.
Yeah, and they were considering
but again, that we're back to it's all adaptations, right? So when Game of Thrones was successful, they said, okay, what else is out there that we can adapt? What is similar? So they started looking through fantasy book series that are long running and that have had a lot of success. And Wheel of Time was on that list. and that's the reason why there's Lord of the Rings shows and all of that. But that was all adaptations, right? Nobody said let's make something like Game of Thrones with original characters, original stories, because when Interview with the Vampire came out, there were like for years and years you couldn't go 2 minutes without hitting a vampire story, but those were for the most part original stories that just were imitating Interview with the Vampire. And that didn't happen for Game of Thrones, right? There are no fantasy shows that are original stories that are just ripping off Game of Thrones, right?
Mm. Is it like, again, you probably have a little more knowledge on it than I do. Was it as common in some of the TV shows back in the day compared?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Fair. Because
it seems to me like when vampires were big, everybody was doing vampires, and then when zombies were big, everybody was doing that for zombies, and when Hunger Games, like when Twilight was big, everybody was doing supernatural teen romance kind of thing. Like these things would go in waves, and it would last a few years, and then they would be run into the ground, and then something else would get big. Harry Potter's another one that also sparked a bunch of imitators. So and I think it seems to me like the way studios and big companies do business is to just look for IPs to adapt, as opposed to own and to adapt, as opposed to what kinds of stories can we tell based on what's popular. That's how it seems to me. And that basically means that these things are kind of locked in place, right? Because if somebody had been doing Star Wars imitations for the last 7-8 years, those would have evolved into something new at some point, or those would have been imitated, and then maybe there would be an entire genre of Star Wars-like stories, which doesn't exist at this point.
Yeah. Do we feel like part of it, and again, maybe not for some of the smaller genres, but part of it could be because like some of the, a lot of these have like high production budgets and things like that, is that the money being invested into it, they are, again, a little bit more risk averse in terms of like the money that they're getting back from it. I feel like a lot of it is just to do with tied up with risk, with as the production becomes a little bit more expensive, as the actors become more expensive, CGI and things like that, everything becomes more expensive. It's just they are looking at it and just trying to assess how can they maximize their profits, and looking to do a rip-off, especially if you're doing something where it's like a space opera like Star Wars, where you have to invest a lot of money, especially if you want to attract a new audience into it, you have to invest a lot of money. So something like Rings of Power, for example, I know that's not essentially a rip-off, and that was backed by Amazon, who have amazing loads amount of money, but something like that, high production budget, wasn't completely received well. They were obliged to do a season 2 just because of having done season 1 and it costing so much. But how long does something like that last, because it wasn't received as well as as well as they probably wanted it to be. And then from there, do they then take another gamble? And that's someone like Amazon. Amazon can afford to lose £1 billion on Rings of Power. Some of these other studios would go bankrupt in attempting to do so.
I think that has something to do with it, that the cost of even trying is higher than it used to be.
Yeah.
And audiences, I think, are not as like when I watch an older show, like early 2000s or from the 90s or something, I enjoy the stories more, but I recognize that story would crash and burn, or that show would crash and burn in the modern day because the production values are too cheap, or the acting is maybe not quite up there or something. And that level of production value, as much as we complain about the cheapness of the latest show shot on the volume, or the latest Netflix production or something, like in the 90s it was lower than that, right? And that means it's more expensive to make anything. So yeah, I guess they've gone back one step in the risk aversion and just stuck to adaptations, I guess. I don't know. I just think we're being deprived of something, and we can't really get new genres this way, because that starts with imitating something that's popular.
I mean, it just takes, again, it takes one production company. I feel like part of it as well could potentially be needing to have someone like Denis sort of Villeneuve, who's just done Dune 2, who has delivered an amazing story. He has the credit in the bank to then go to a to a studio and say, I want to make this. This is how my movies have been received for the past however many movies that I've done. Give me a budget. I will deliver you something amazing. And I feel like that's probably what will drive it a little bit more, as opposed to the decision coming from, the corporate level in terms of sort of wanting to do new stories.
But directors like that are getting fewer and fewer, right? You've got Nolan, you've got Villeneuve. And then those are the two that immediately come to mind, but there's just a small list of people who can just do whatever they want, right?
Yeah.
And most of them want to, do adaptations of various things. Like Villeneuve is doing Rendezvous with Rama soon. I don't think it's the next one that he does. After that, he's doing more Dune. So it's not like he's saying, okay, now I'm gonna start churning out all these new stories. And whenever somebody tries, we get something like Rebel Moon, where somebody, for whatever reason, gets to do whatever he wants, not because he's a good storyteller, but because he can play the game well, right? And therefore he gets his blank checks. I don't know. I think that definitely has something to do with it.
Yeah.
It just seems to be this trend that I don't think I've seen anybody talk about.
Yeah, I was gonna say you're bringing awareness to this, because I didn't realize it until you just mentioned it. I was like, oh yeah, you're right. It doesn't mean that much. I thought there were ripoffs because I remember the Purge for a time. There was a lot of Purge ripoffs that came. I don't know when the latest.
But that's this weird effect, right? I think that is something to do with COVID, where everybody feels like it was 2 years ago, when actually it was 6 or 7 or 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So things feel more recent than they actually were. And like all the examples you've given, I think, without looking them up, maybe a few were more recent, but they all seem at least 10 years ago. 10 years is a lot of time. So in closing, more derivative works, please, because that's how you get evolution.
Guys, you heard it first from Danny G himself. And guys, let us know what you think. Do we need more ripoffs?
Yeah, and maybe I'm completely off base, and maybe maybe it's just in the specific corners that I'm interested in. Maybe in other genres, this happens the same. It's always happened, but it just doesn't. At least in the at the top tier of like public awareness and pop culture, it seems to not be there anymore. I don't know.
Yeah, guys. Well, thank you for tuning into today's episode. Hervé, I don't know if you got enough energy, but
always. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, of course.
Hey guys, and we will catch you next week. Au revoir.
Ciao.
Bye.